Section 27 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Place Names the Place, Part 8. We came down towards Udimesnil. Suddenly I was overwhelmed with that profound happiness which I had not often felt since Combray. Happiness analogous to that which had been given me by, among other things, the steeples of Martinville. But this time it remained incomplete. I had just seen, standing a little way back from the steep ridge over which we were passing, 3 trees, probably marking the entrance to a shady avenue, which made a pattern at which I was looking now not for the first time. I could not succeed in reconstructing the place from which they had been, as it were, detached, but I felt that it had been familiar to me once, so that my mind, having wavered between some distant year and the present moment, Baalbec and its surroundings began to dissolve, and I asked myself whether the whole of this drive were not a make-believe. Baalbec, a place to which I had never gone save in imagination, Madame de Villeparis's, a character in a story, and the 3 old trees, the reality which one recaptures on raising one's eyes from the book which one has been reading, and which describes an environment into which one has come to believe that one has been bodily transported. I looked at the 3 trees. I could see them plainly, but my mind felt that they were concealing something which it had not grasped, as when things are placed out of our reach, so that our fingers, stretched out at arm's length, can only touch for a moment their outer surface, and can take hold of nothing. Then we rest for a little while before thrusting out our arm with refreshed vigor, and trying to reach an inch or 2 farther. But if my mind was thus to collect itself, to gather strength, I should have to be alone. What would I not have given to be able to escape as I used to do on those walks along the Guermantes way, when I detached myself from my parents? It seemed indeed that I ought to do so now. I recognized that kind of pleasure which requires, it is true, a certain effort on the part of the mind, but in comparison with which the attractions of the inertia which inclines us to renounce that pleasure seem very slight. That pleasure, the object of which I could but dimly feel, that pleasure which I must create for myself, I experienced only on rare occasions, but on each of these it seemed to me that the things which had happened in the interval were of but scant importance, and that in attaching myself to the reality of that pleasure alone, I could at length begin to lead a new life. I laid my hand for a moment across my eyes, so as to be able to shut them without Madame de Villeparis's noticing. I sat there, thinking of nothing. Then, with my thoughts collected, compressed, and strengthened, I sprang farther forward in the direction of the trees, or rather in that inverse direction at the end of which I could see them growing within myself. I felt again behind them the same object, known to me and yet vague, which I could not bring nearer. And yet all 3 of them, as the carriage moved on, I could see coming towards me. Where had I looked at them before? There was no place near Combray where an avenue opened off the road like that. The sight which they recalled to me, there was no room for it either in the scenery of the place in Germany where I had gone one year with my grandmother to take the waters. Was I to suppose, then, that they came from years already so remote in my life that the landscape which accompanied them had been entirely obliterated from my memory, and that, like the pages which, with sudden emotion, we recognize in a book which we imagined that we had never read, they surged up by themselves out of the forgotten chapter of my earliest infancy? Were they not rather to be numbered among those dream landscapes, always the same, at least for me, in whom their unfamiliar aspect was but the objectivation in my dreams of the efforts that I had been making while awake, either to penetrate the mystery of a place beneath the outward appearance of which I was dimly conscious of there being something more, as had so often happened to me on the Guermantes way, or to succeed in bringing mystery back to a place which I had longed to know, and which, from the day on which I had come to know it, had seemed to me to be wholly superficial, like Baalbec? Or were they but an image freshly extracted from a dream of the night before, but already so worn, so altered, that it seemed to me to come from somewhere far more distant? Or had I indeed never seen them before? Did they conceal beneath their surface, like the trees, like the tufts of grass that I had seen beside the Guermantes way, a meaning as obscure, as hard to grasp as is a distant past? So that, whereas they were pleading with me that I would master a new idea, I imagined that I had to identify something in my memory? Or again, were they concealing no hidden thought, and was it simply my strained vision that made me see them double in time as one occasionally sees things double in space? I could not tell, and yet all the time they were coming towards me. Perhaps some fabulous apparition, a ring of witches or of Norns who would propound their oracles to me. I chose rather to believe that they were phantoms of the past, dear companions of my childhood, vanished friends who recalled our common memories. Like ghosts, they seemed to be appealing to me to take them with me, to bring them back to life. In their simple, passionate gesticulation, I could discern the helpless anguish of a beloved person who has lost the power of speech and feels that he will never be able to say to us what he wishes to say, and we can never guess. Presently, at a crossroads, the carriage left them. It was bearing me away from what alone I believed to be true, what would have made me truly happy. It was like my life. I watched the trees gradually withdraw, waving their despairing arms, seeming to say to me, "What you fail to learn from us today, you will never know. If you allow us to drop back into the hollow of this road from which we sought to raise ourselves up to you, a whole part of yourself which we were bringing to you will fall forever into the abyss." And indeed, if, in the course of time, I did discover the kind of pleasure and of disturbance which I had just been feeling once again, and if one evening, too late, but then for all time, I fastened myself to it, of those trees themselves I was never to know what they had been trying to give me, nor where else I had seen them. And when, the road having forked and the carriage with it, I turned my back on them and ceased to see them, with Madame de Villeparis's asking me what I was dreaming about, I was as wretched as though I had just lost a friend, had died myself, had broken faith with the dead, or had denied my God. It was time to be thinking of home. Madame de Villeparis, who had a certain feeling for nature, colder than that of my grandmother, but capable of recognizing, even outside museums and noblemen's houses, the simple and majestic beauty of certain old and venerable things, told her coachman to take us back by the old Balbec road, a road little used but planted with old elm trees, which we thought quite admirable. Once we had got to know this road, for a change we would return, that is, if we had not taken it on the outward journey, by another which ran through the woods of Chantereine and Canteleu. The invisibility of the numberless birds that took up one another's song close beside us in the trees gave me the same sense of being at rest that one has when one shuts one's eyes. Chained to my back seat like Prometheus on his rock, I listened to my Oceanides. And when it so happened that I caught a glimpse of one of those birds as it passed from one leaf to another, there was so little apparent connection between it and the songs that I heard that I could not believe that I was beholding their cause in that little body, fluttering, startled, and unseeing. This road was like many others of the same kind which are to be found in France, climbing on a fairly steep gradient to its summit, and then gradually falling for the rest of the way. At the time, I found no great attraction in it. I was only glad to be home. But it became for me, later on, a frequent source of joy by remaining in my memory as a lodestone to which all the similar roads that I was to take, on walks or drives or journeys, would at once attach themselves without breach of continuity, and would be able, thanks to it, to communicate directly with my heart. For as soon as the carriage or the motor car turned into one of these roads that seemed to be merely the continuation of the road along which I had driven with Madame de Villeparis, the matter to which I found my consciousness directly applying itself, as to the most recent event in my part, would be, all the intervening years being quietly obliterated, the impressions that I had had on those bright summer afternoons and evenings, driving round Balbec, when the leaves smelt good, a mist rose from the ground, and beyond the village close at hand one could see through the trees the sun setting as though it had been merely some place farther along the road, a forest place and distant, which we should not have time to reach that evening. Harmonized with what I was feeling now in another place, on a similar road, surrounded by all the accessory sensations of breathing deep draughts of air, of curiosity, indolence, appetite, lightness of heart, which were common to them both, and excluding all others, these impressions would be reinforced, would take on the consistency of a particular type of pleasure, and almost of a setting of life which, as it happened, I rarely had the luck to come across, but in which these awakened memories placed, amid the reality that my senses could perceive, no small part of a reality suggested, dreamed, unseizable, to give me, among those regions through which I was passing, more than an aesthetic feeling, a transient but exalted ambition to stay there and to live always. How often since then, simply because I could smell green leaves, has not being seated on a back seat opposite Madame de Villeparis's, meeting the Princesse de Luxembourg, who waved a greeting to her from her own carriage, coming back to dinner at the Grand Hotel, appeared to me as one of those indescribable happinesses which neither the present nor the future can restore to us, which we may taste only once in a lifetime. Often dusk would have fallen before we reached the hotel. Timidly I would quote to Madame de Villeparis's, pointing to the moon in the sky, some memorable expression of Chateaubriand or Vignay or Victor Hugo, shedding abroad that ancient secret of melancholy, or weeping like Diana by the brink of her streams, or the shadows nuptial, solemn and august. "And so you think that good, do you?" she would ask. "Inspired, as you call it? I must confess that I am always surprised to see people taking things seriously nowadays, which the friends of those gentlemen, while doing ample justice to their merits, were the first to laugh at. People weren't so free then with the word inspired as they are now, when if you say to a writer that he has mere talent, he thinks you're insulting him. You quote me a fine line from Monsieur de Chateaubriand about moonlight. You shall see that I have my own reasons for being refractory. Monsieur de Chateaubriand used constantly to come see my father. He was quite a pleasant person when you were alone with him, because then he was simple and amusing, but the moment he had an audience he would begin to pose, and then he became absurd. When my father was in the room, he pretended that he had flung his resignation in the king's face, and that he had controlled the voting in the conclave, forgetting that it was my father whom he had asked to beg the king to take him back, and that my father had heard him make the most idiotic forecasts of the papal election. You ought to have heard Monsieur de Blacas on that famous conclave. He was a very different kind of man from Monsieur de Chateaubriand. As to his fine phrases about the moon, they became part of our regular program for entertaining our guests. Whenever there was any moonlight about the house, if there was anyone staying with us for the first time, he would be told to take Monsieur de Chateaubriand for a stroll after dinner. When they came in, my father would take his guest aside and say, "Well, and was Monsieur de Chateaubriand very eloquent?" "Oh, yes." "He's been talking about the moon." "Yes, how did you know?" "One moment, didn't he say—" And then my father would quote the passage. "He did, but how in the world?" "And he spoke to you of the moonlight on the Roman Campagna?" "But my dear sir, you're a magician." My father was no magician, but Monsieur de Chateaubriand had the same little speech about the moon, which he served up every time. At the mention of Vignay, she laughed. The man who said, "I am the Comte Alfred de Vignay." One is either a comte or one isn't. It is not of the slightest importance. And then perhaps she discovered that it was after all of some slight importance, for she went on. "For one thing, I am by no means sure that he was, and in any case he was of the humblest origin, that gentleman who speaks in his verses of his esquire's crest. In such charming taste, is it not, and so interesting to his readers. Like Musset, a plain Paris cit, who laid so much stress on the golden falcon that surmounts my helm. As if you would ever hear a real gentleman say a thing like that. And yet Musset had some talent as a poet. But except Saint-Mars, I have never been able to read a thing by Monsieur de Vignay. I get so bored that the book falls from my hands. Monsieur Molé, who had all the cleverness and tact that were wanting in Monsieur de Vignay, put him properly in his place when he welcomed him to the Academy. Do you mean to say you don't know the speech? It is a masterpiece of irony and impertinence. She found fault with Balzac, whom she was surprised to see her nephews admire, for having pretended to describe a society in which he was never received, and of which his descriptions were wildly improbable. As for Victor Hugo, she told us that Monsieur de Bouillon, her father, who had friends among the young leaders of the Romantic movement, had been taken by some of them to the first performance of Hernani, but that he had been unable to sit through it, so ridiculous had he found the lines of that talented but extravagant writer, who had acquired the title of Major Poet only by virtue of having struck a bargain, and as a reward for the not disinterested indulgence that he showed to the dangerous errors of the Socialists. We had now come in sight of the hotel, with its lights, so hostile that first evening on our arrival, now protecting and kind, speaking to us of home. And when the carriage drew up outside the door, the porter, the pages, the lift boy, attentive, clumsy, vaguely uneasy at our lateness, were numbered, now that they had grown familiar, among those beings who change so many times in the course of our life, as we ourselves change, but by whom, when they are for the time being the mirror of our habits, we find something attractive in the feeling that we are being faithfully reflected and in a friendly spirit. We prefer them to friends whom we have not seen for some time, for they contain more of what we actually are. Only the outside page, exposed to the sun all day, had been taken indoors for protection from the cold night air, and swaddled in thick woolen garments, which, combined with the orange effulgence of his locks and the curiously red bloom of his cheeks, made one, seeing him there through the glass front of the hall, think of a hothouse plant muffled up for protection from the frost. We got out of the carriage with the help of a great many more servants than were required, but they were conscious of the importance of the scene, and each felt obliged to take some part in it. I was always very hungry, and so, often, so as not to keep dinner waiting, I would not go upstairs first to the room which had succeeded in becoming so really mine that to catch sight of its long violet curtains and low bookcases was to find myself alone again with that self of which things, like people, gave me a reflected image. But we would all wait together in the hall until the head waiter came to tell us that our dinner was ready, and this gave us another opportunity of listening to Madame de Villeparis's. "But you must be tired of us by now," protested my grandmother. "Not at all. Why, I am delighted. What could be nicer?" replied her friend with a winning smile, drawing out, almost intoning her words in a way that contrasted markedly with her customary simplicity of speech. And indeed, at such moments as this, she was not natural. Her mind reverted to her early training, to the aristocratic manner in which a great lady is supposed to show common people that she is glad to see them, that she is not at all stiff. And her one and only failure in true politeness lay in this excess of politeness, which it was easy to identify as one of the professional wrinkles of a lady of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, who, always seeing in her humbler friends the latent discontent that she must one day arouse in their bosoms, greedily seizes every opportunity on which she can possibly, in the ledger in which she keeps her social account with them, write down a credit balance which will allow her to enter presently on the opposite page the dinner or reception to which she will not invite them. And so, having long ago taken effect in her once and for all, and ignoring the fact that now both the consequences and the people concerned were different, that in Paris she hoped to see us often come to her house, the spirit of her caste was urging Madame de Villeparis on with feverish ardor, and as if the time that was allowed her for being kind to us was limited, to multiply, while we were still at Balbec, her gifts of roses and melons, loans of books, drives in her carriage, and verbal effusions. And for that reason, quite as much as the dazzling glories of the beach, the many-colored flamboyance and subaqueous light of the rooms, as much even as the riding lessons by which tradesmen's sons were deified like Alexander of Macedon, the daily kindness shown us by Madame de Villeparis, and also the unaccustomed momentary holiday ease with which my grandmother accepted them, have remained in my memory as typical of life at a watering place. "Give them your cloaks to take upstairs." My grandmother handed hers to the manager, and because he had been so nice to me I was distressed by this want of consideration which seemed to pain him. "I think you've hurt his feeling," said the Marquess. "He probably fancies himself too great a gentleman to carry your wraps. I remember so well the Duc de Nemours, when I was still quite little, coming to see my father, who was living then on the top floor of the Bouillon house, with a fat parcel under his arm of letters and newspapers. I can see the prince now in his blue coat, framed in our doorway, which had such pretty woodwork round it. I think it was Bogard made it. You know those fine lathes that they used to cut, so supple that the joiner would twist them sometimes into little shells and flowers, like the ribbons round a nosegay? "Here you are, Cyrus," he said to my father. "Look what your porter's given me to bring you. He said to me, 'Since you're going up to see the Count, it's not worth my while climbing all those stairs, but take care you don't break the string.' Now that you have got rid of your things, why don't you sit down? Look, sit in this seat," she said to my grandmother, taking her by the hand. "Oh, if you don't mind, not in that one. There is not room for two, and it's too big for me by myself. I shouldn't feel comfortable." You remind me, for it was exactly like this, of a seat that I had for many years, until at last I couldn't keep it any longer, because it had been given to my mother by the poor Duchesse de Prousseline. My mother, though she was the simplest person in the world really, had ideas that belonged to another generation, which even in those days I could scarcely understand, and at first she had not been at all willing to let herself be introduced to Madame de Prousseline, who had been plain Mademoiselle Sebastiani, while she, because she was a duchess, felt that it was not for her to be introduced to my mother. "And really, you know," Madame de Villaparisis went on, forgetting that she herself did not understand these fine shades of distinction, even if she had just been Madame de Choiseul, there was a good deal to be said for her claim. "The Choiseuls are everything you could want. They spring from a sister of Louis the Fat. They were ruling princes down in Bassigny. I admit that we beat them in marriages and in distinction, but the precedence is pretty much the same." This little difficulty gave rise to several amusing incidents, such as a luncheon party which was kept waiting a whole hour or more before one of these ladies could make up her mind to let herself be introduced to the other. In spite of which they became great friends, and she gave my mother a seat like that, in which people always refused to sit, just as you did, until one day my mother heard a carriage drive into the courtyard. She asked a young servant we had who it was. "The Duchesse de la Rochefoucauld, ma'am." "Very well, say that I am at home." A quarter of an hour passed. No one came. "What about the Duchesse de la Rochefoucauld?" my mother asked. "Where is she?" "She's on the stairs, ma'am, getting her breath," said the young servant, who had not been long up from the country, where my mother had the excellent habit of getting all her servants. Often she had seen them born. That's the only way to get really good ones, and they're the rarest of luxuries. And sure enough, the Duchesse de la Rochefoucauld had the greatest difficulty in getting upstairs, for she was an enormous woman, so enormous indeed that when she did come into the room, my mother was quite at a loss for a moment to know where to put her. And then the seat that Madame de Prousseline had given her caught her eye. "Won't you sit down?" she said, bringing it forward. And the Duchesse filled it from side to side. She was quite a pleasant woman for all her massiveness. "She still creates an effect when she comes in," one of our friends said once. "She certainly creates an effect when she goes out," said my mother, who was rather more free in her speech than would be thought proper nowadays. Even in Madame de la Rochefoucauld's own drawing-room, people weren't afraid to make fun of her to her face, at which she was always the first to laugh, over her ample proportions. "But are you all alone?" my grandmother once asked Monsieur de la Rochefoucauld, when she had come to pay a call on the Duchess, and being met at the door by him, had not seen his wife, who was at the other end of the room. "Is Madame de la Rochefoucauld not at home?" "I don't see her." "How charming of you," replied the Duke, who had about the worst judgment of any man I have ever known, but was not altogether lacking in humor. End of section 27.